Everybody for coming today. Welcome to Treaty 1 territory, the homeland of the Manitoba and Red River Métis. We're here in Coronation Park in St. Boniface to talk about the Manitoba Liberal plan to address homelessness and housing. We're here in this park because this park has often been home to folks who are homeless. There are still some sleeping bags and stuff around, but we've had encampments behind us in the bushes, and that's something that should not be happening. We've seen homeless encampments under the Norwood Bridge, in bus shelters on St. Mary's and Goulet, and across the city. And I have to say, I don't know in my lifetime when I've ever seen things worse. I don't know when I've ever seen more suffering in our province. And it's important to note, people talk about the pandemic breaking systems, but somebody corrected me the other day, and they said, it's really that the pandemic showed how broken our systems already were. And that's something that people who work with people who are homeless already knew. During the day, for people who are homeless, there is no place to go. So in the pandemic, that really hit hard because people were still being kicked out of shelters in the middle of winter when it's minus 30, minus 37, and have to spend the day trying to find someplace warm. The reverse is true in summer, where it's 30 plus degrees and people have to try to find places to find water or to find food when they don't have the supports. So during the pandemic, everything that was closed, the coffee shops, the libraries, food courts, all the places that homeless people actually gathered from shelters were shut down. And the result was what we saw was that people started taking up places to live in bus shacks and across the city. We have to recognize being homeless for that individual is an emergency. It's not something that can be put off or handled another day. The act of becoming homeless for people is traumatic in itself. It can ruin their mental health. Some are people who've lost everything. Some are people who never had anything. And the reality is that in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, we've had 40 plus years of neglect of our fellow Manitobans at the provincial level. We're talking about children and mothers, people with disabilities and mental illness, and sometimes people who just suffered an accident or a relationship breakup, a flood. They lent money to somebody who didn't pay them back, or an employer bounced a check, and suddenly they're out on the street. The 2022 Winnipeg Street Census showed that 68% of those who are experiencing homelessness are Indigenous, with 89%, 9 out of 10 people who are sleeping outdoors being Indigenous. And it is estimated that more than half, 52% of the people who are homeless on the streets of Winnipeg were once in the custody of Manitoba's own Child and Family Services system. To put this in context, what has happened in Canada with Indigenous children under CFS? It's sometimes been compared by notable figures like Murray Sinclair and Cindy Blackstock to say that the CFS system is a modern residential school. In the last 20 years, the Manitoba government was seizing thousands of Indigenous children from their families. They also seized the federal child allowance for those children, and supports ended when they were 18. That is why those individuals are immediately being made homeless. They are being abandoned by the Manitoba government, which had an obligation to care for them. And this is not, when we talk about the harms of the past, this is happening right now. This is happening this week. This is happening this year. We need to recognize that this harm is continually being done. The other is that the Manitoba government discharges people who've finished paying their debt to society straight from provincial jails into homeless shelters or the street, where they're then rearrested and end up back in jail. When we talk about the causes of homelessness in Manitoba, a huge portion of that are the failures of the provincial government to do the bare minimum to care for its own citizens. And these are system failures that are entirely up to the provincial government. The federal government does not have a role to play in it. Social assistance in Manitoba, EIA, is the same as it was, for the most part, in 1986. In 1992, the PC government rolled back EIA rates to 1986 levels and froze them there, and they've been there ever since. It didn't matter whether the NDP was elected again and again or the PCs were elected again and again. They've been getting raises The people at the top, the Premier, MLAs, ministers, have all been getting raises and bonuses for 36 years. And people who are among the poorest in our society, people with disabilities, people with mental illnesses, have not seen an increase in funding to help them keep a roof over their head and just make sure that they can actually afford to eat for 36 years. These are the factors that lead to poverty, to homelessness, and quite frankly, to desperation. And we have to say this: being homeless is not a crime. Being poor is not a crime. Being an addict is not a crime. Yet both the PCs and the NDP keep saying that these are the root causes of crime. They aren't. The idea here, being presented by the PCs and the NDP, that people who are homeless or poor or who are mentally ill did something wrong and they need to be corrected, when all they need is some basic supports. That person who is homeless or poor has a name. They were once a baby held in their own mother's arms. They are our fellow Manitobans, and we've been failing them for too long. And that's why we resolved to end homelessness in Manitoba. Today, Manitoba Liberals are recommitting to a program of same-day housing to make sure that people who are unhoused can get safe shelter the same day. Right now in Manitoba, under the PCs, you have to be chronically homeless for 6 months to get housing. The NDP plan, under their so-called Houston model, will take 8 years. This is not acceptable. That is not ending homelessness. So our commitment is to same-day housing. We would model anti-homelessness programs that already exist and are successful in other cities, and we will have it fully running by 2025 to ensure by that year no one in Manitoba has to sleep in a park or in a bus shelter. We will work with the federal government, the City of Winnipeg, Indigenous leadership and organizations, AMM and non-profit organizations to develop and identify 10,000 housing unit options, including identifying and repurposing currently vacant spaces and buildings. We will also work with private landlords to identify available spaces for placement. As John Gerard knows, he spoke to somebody who was in Medicine Hat, which has in Alberta, not necessarily a place known for its, let's say, progressive social programs. In Medicine Hat, he was homeless, and authorities approached him and said, "You cannot be homeless in Medicine Hat. We have to give you a place to live." That's basically what happens. So we will also introduce innovative financing models that are available to directly use savings from police and health budgets when agencies reduce those costs with housing, training, and support services. This is something that's been proposed by folks. Basically, the police and emergency services pay agencies to keep them out of trouble. And we actually find that that's highly effective. So as long as somebody who is a so-called heavy user, or somebody who ends up being in the ER or in the back of a police car 3 times a week, somebody who ends up in trouble or in hospital, we end up specifically working with agencies to protect and support that one person to make sure that they're not ending up in deep, deep trouble and making sure they have a warm place to stay. We actually anticipate that this could reduce costs because a day in hospital, the ER, or in police custody can cost between $500 and $1,000 a day, while stable supportive housing may be $40 or $50 a day. That is important. The importance of same-day housing in preventing people from getting hurt, in preventing things from getting worse. It ultimately will save us money. Second, we have to recognize that ending homelessness in Manitoba is an act of reconciliation. This is yet another reason why we cannot wait the 8 years the NDP want us to, or the 6 months the PCs will. Again, the 2022 Winnipeg Street Census showed that 68% of those who are experiencing homelessness are Indigenous, with 89% sleeping outdoors being Indigenous. This is due directly to current provincial government policy under the PCs and NDP, because 50% of the people who are homeless on the streets of Winnipeg were in CFS. There are still people in Manitoba who are homeless from First Nations being flooded in the 2011 by the provincial government. Homelessness is not something that's caused by the behavior of individuals. It's been caused by policy failures of this government. We have also already committed to emergency shelters for women and to funding halfway houses for former provincial inmates and funding for Native Clan. which we also see as addressing homelessness as an act of reconciliation. We will also introduce strong new measures to protect and support the tenants of Manitoba housing, and we will ensure that Manitoba housing buildings are held to high standards of safety, security, support, and pest control. Just one word about the Residential Tenancies Branch, the RTB. Under the RTB, whether it's the NDP or the PCs, thousands and thousands of above guideline rent increases were approved and rubber stamped. They seem to go through without any fight, and there's also a real threat that people are being evicted, sometimes for little reason, so-called renovictions. Given current rent levels and the threat to seniors, this is unacceptable. We have to make sure that we're protecting seniors and tenants from being evicted for no other reason than that the landlord wants to make a bit more money. We also want to make sure that we'll make sure that people who escape homelessness and poverty for good, the necessary supports need to be provided to assess and treat the reasons that people who are homeless. That includes poverty, addictions, the CFS system, learning disabilities, ADHD, FASD, autism, and those who are 2S LGBTQ. These are all areas where people who are vulnerable are being made homeless. We will directly address those issues. We've already announced creating shelters dedicated to women and families in Winnipeg, Brandon, and Thompson. There are currently no emergency shelters whatsoever for women and families fleeing domestic violence. We will do that. Now, I'll close by saying something that I've said a few times, which I think embodies what we believe as Manitoba Liberals, which is the worse you treat someone, the more it's going to cost you. If you want to reduce the costs of people who are in ERs or police cars or in hospital, we can do that by providing better ongoing care for them, by ensuring there's a roof over their head. In this case, the contrast between Manitoba Liberals and the other parties could not be clearer. The PCs actively made homelessness worse. The PCs actively made homelessness worse, and their major focus continues to be just expanding shelters with mats on floors. The NDP's commitment to end homelessness is after 2 terms, after 8 years. Manitoba Liberals, it's not just that we're offering a real choice and a real change for our homeless relatives. We're the only party offering any choice and any change. Thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you.
Alors, je peux la faire en français aussi, mais si vous avez des questions en anglais ou français, if you've got questions in English and French, I'll take them. Pardon? OK, absolument, oui. Ce que veut dire, à l'heure actuelle, au Manitoba, sous le gouvernement conservateur, il faut être sans-abri chronique depuis 6 mois pour obtenir un logement. Le plan de l'NPD, selon son modèle de Houston, prendra 8 ans. Notre premier engagement en tant que libéraux manitobains est celui du logement le jour même. Nous nous inspirerons des programmes de lutte contre l'itinérance mis en place dans d'autres villes. Nous ferons en sorte que ce programme soit pleinement opérationnel d'ici 2025 afin que plus personne ne dorme dans les parcs ou les abribus du Manitoba d'ici à là. Deuxièmement, nous devons reconnaître que mettre fin au sans-abrisme est un acte de réconciliation. C'est l'une des raisons pour lesquelles nous ne pouvons pas attendre. Le recensement des rues de Winnipeg de 2022 a montré que 68% des sans-abri sont autochtones et 99% des personnes dormant à l'extérieur sont autochtones. Cela est directement dû à la politique actuelle du gouvernement provincial sous les conservateurs et l'NPD. Plus de 50% des sans-abri dans les rues de Winnipeg étaient pris en charge par les services sociaux d'urgence et nombre d'entre eux sortent directement des prisons provinciales pour devenir des sans-abri. Il y a encore des sans-abri au Manitoba car de nombreuses Premières Nations ont été inondées en 2011 par le gouvernement provincial. Alors, nous avons déjà engagé à créer des abris d'urgence pour les femmes et à financer des maisons de transition pour les anciens détenus provinciaux et à financer le clan autochtone, Native Clan. On va aussi ajouter de nouvelles mesures fortes pour protéger et soutenir les locataires de logements Manitoba. Nous veillerons à ce que tous les immeubles de logement Manitoba soient soumis à de normes élevées en matière de sécurité, de soutien et de lutte contre les parasites. On va renforcer la direction de la location à l'usage d'habitation, protéger les locataires et les aînés contre les hausses de loyer incontrôlées et les expulsions injustes. Et et les libéraux du Manitoba aideront également les gens à sortir définitivement de l'itinérance et de la pauvreté. Les soutiens nécessaires doivent être fournis pour évaluer et traiter les raisons pour lesquelles les gens sont sans abri, y compris la pauvreté, la toxicomanie, le système de services à l'enfance et à la famille, les troubles d'apprentissage, l'autisme et les personnes qui sont LGBTQ. Pour finir, je terminerai en disant quelque chose que j'ai déjà dit à plusieurs reprises, qui est un principe des libéraux du Manitoba. Plus que vous traitez mal quelqu'un, plus cela vous coûtera cher. Si vous voulez réduire les coûts de personnes qui se retrouvent aux urgences, dans les voitures de police ou à l'hôpital, nous pouvons les fournir des meilleurs soins continus en veillant à ce qu'elles aient un toit au-dessus de leur tête. Les libéraux du Manitoba ne se contentent pas d'offrir un vrai choix et un vrai changement à nos proches sans-abri. Nous sommes le seul parti à offrir un choix et un changement. Merci. C'est mieux? Bien, pour les évacuations, il y a deux choses. Pour les locataires, il faut être élu pour faire le changement, mais surtout parce qu'il y a deux choses qu'on peut faire, plusieurs choses qu'on peut faire avec les locataires. La première chose, c'est d'avoir de règlements qui sont plus forts, parce qu'à ce point, si vous avez le louer à peu près 1 600 $ par mois, si c'est au-dessus de ça, il n'y a pas de règlement. Alors, il peut lever le louer à n'importe quel niveau. Alors, il faut augmenter le nombre le montant où on peut contrôler les loyers. Et l'autre chose, d'assurer de prévenir les évictions, parce que à ce point, il y a beaucoup de gens qui ont les appartements qui proposent des ossements sans justification. Alors, vraiment, pour avoir des règlements plus forts, être certain, parce que, comme j'ai dit, même sur l'NPD et les conservateurs, ils passaient plus que 2000... il y avait des gens, les landlords qui demandaient 2000 landlords par année qui demandaient des ossements au-dessus de ce qu'ils devraient avoir. Et il était toujours approuvé. Alors, il faut vraiment revisiter ça pour assurer qu'on n'est pas toujours en train de seulement dire oui, et parce qu'il faut protéger les aînés, mais aussi les locataires.
What's the estimated cost? A lot of homeless people are living with PTSD.
Yep.
Makes being homeless a major thing for them.
Yeah.
Any incentives to help with PTSD?
So one of the things, as we mentioned, that we would do, we would actually do an assessment of folks, right? And you say, well, what is it? What are the reasons that you are homeless? One of them can be PTSD from being homeless. So when we talk about providing supports to people, it's making sure that they have mental health supports as well as addiction supports. Honestly, if one of the things we could do would be to increase, if we already have the Bell Hotel, which actually does this. If we had 5 Bell Hotels, it would make an enormous difference. Yeah. We're going to be releasing a fully costed platform, but some of these things, if you set it up in terms of, as we're suggesting, to say, if the police aren't doing overtime taking care of people who are homeless, if we have EMTs who don't have to be taking care of people who are homeless on overtime, we can be paying people to take care of these folks, get them off the streets, and it'll actually be a much lower cost than doing it through emergency services. So ultimately, this is something that reduces costs because you're not spending as much on emergency services. There have been stories in the paper about a particular individual might cost 1.7. A single person can cost $1.7 million a year. So we could actually be, with that amount of money, you could be buying people entire houses and staffing them. Instead, what we're doing, so this is really about moving to prevention. It's really moving about keeping people safe. But at the end of the day, it won't cost more. It'll cost less because we're going to reduce crises.
Il y a aujourd'hui dans certains centres, certains abris, il faut être sobre pour y entrer. Est-ce que c'est une condition que vous appliquerez à votre secondary housing programme?
Non, pas du tout. Parce qu'on sait, c'est un problème énorme et je vais le répondre en anglais aussi parce que c'est vraiment important. Encore et encore, on demande aux gens qui sont sans abri ou les autres gens qui sont parfaits pour les aider. Ça fait aucun sens. Ou pour demander qu'ils sont sobres, ça fait aucun sens. Il faut les accepter comme ils le sont. Et quand on fait ça, c'est ça le point où on peut commencer la guérison. So the question was whether we would insist that people are sober. The answer is no. We know that demanding perfection of people who have just come off the street and asking is not acceptable, and expecting people to just do, if they've got a substance problem, to just quit cold turkey doesn't make sense. The healing begins when you get those people inside, and then you can start to treat them right away with recovery programs as well as mental health supports. We know that for a fact. It's extremely difficult for people who've been outside, but the idea that we can just expect we're only going to take homeless people who don't have problems means that we're active. This has been the problem in Manitoba, is that programs have actively cut out and made it impossible for people to get help. And that's what putting a sobriety condition does. It makes it impossible for the people who need the help the most to actually get it. Which is why we don't support it.
So you mentioned CFS a lot and what's contributing to homelessness in Manitoba.
Yep.
Does the Liberal Party have any plans to change the CFS system? Or?
Yes. Yeah, we haven't. We've already announced a bit of it, but I'll say, look, in 2007 we committed to overhauling it entirely, which it still needs to be. It can't just. We need to be working with Indigenous people, but and First Nations especially. We need to focus on keeping families together and supporting them, so that we're not taking children away. But the other thing about it is that these hundreds of people who were living on the streets of Winnipeg were taken by the Manitoba government from their families and thrown back on the street. They've been abandoned. Not only that, when they were taken, they had their money taken from them too. So the PC and NDP governments were found to have violated the human rights of every single one of those children by not only by taking them from their families, but by taking $338 million in federal benefits that was not theirs to take. In opposition, the PCs called it illegal and immoral. In opposition, the NDP called it theft. They were both right when they were in opposition, but they both did it in government. So one of these things is we have to make this commitment to going after, to returning that money. We are the only party that has committed, from the day that this happened, we were the only party that committed to returning that money to children in CFS, which is essential. There are children who had $90,000 taken from them by the Manitoba government. Just one kid. And then they end up being thrown out on the street. So this is a matter of reconciliation and justice. But yes, absolutely, we would continue to reform the CFS system, compensate the children who've been taken, because I'm serious. When people talk about Manitoba and CFS being the next residential schools, Manitoba CFS is one of the biggest and worst residential schools in the history of this country. There are far more children in the custody of CFS than there were in residential schools at the height of their operation in Manitoba. And residential schools, and they were taking newborn babies, and they are still taking newborn babies on a regular basis. That's the reality that we're talking about. This is one of the reasons why we have homelessness, because fundamentally, Indigenous people have had their families ripped apart nonstop for 150 years. And that's what we need to change.
Vous vous aviez travaillé à développer ou trouver 10 000 housing options
Oui, oui.
plus. Comment est-ce que vous comptez encourager les promoteurs immobiliers à développer des nouveaux appartements ou de nouveaux endroits?
Ben, il y a plusieurs façons de le faire, mais il y a déjà un agrément entre le gouvernement fédéral et la province du Manitoba de 400 millions pour l'abri. Alors, il y a deux façons de le faire. On peut encourager, on peut être en partenariat. Mais l'autre chose, c'est de dire que quand vous construisez un développement, il faut qu'une certaine partie de 10%, 15% de ce développement est abordable. Alors, ça, c'est une des façons de le faire. Mais il y a beaucoup de façons. Ça, c'est un exemple comment on peut le faire. Mais c'est essentiel de le construire et d'avoir des partenariats. Mais aussi parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'édifices maintenant qui sont presque vides ou demi-vides. C'est quelque chose où la ville de Winnipeg veut le faire aussi pour assurer que on peut réutiliser beaucoup de ces édifices pour l'abri et non seulement pour l'espace commercial. So just quickly what he said, he was asking about what we could do in terms of private development. Look, one of the things is the province of Manitoba had a $400 million housing program with the federal government. That money is there. We can also talk about requiring that when developers build a development, that 10 or 15% of it, a certain percentage of it, be set aside for affordable housing. And so those are a couple of the options. And the other is that I know Mayor Scott Gillingham has talked about it. We have all these buildings downtown which are empty, some of which can be repurposed. So it's also about using the most of what we already have. If we've got empty spaces, why do we have people living on the street?
What about using funding for organizations like Community 204 Initiative? These people are on the street directly helping the homeless people.
Yeah, so we were absolutely. I mean, it's a separate announcement. But we are going to be having an announcement where we're talking about making sure that nonprofits have the funding they need to hire people and keep running. So that is the good work that they're doing. Like it's a separate announcement, but we want to make sure that so many organizations are stuck and they spend an enormous amount of money asking for funding. So we want to make that easier, more streamlined, make the granting process earlier, and make sure that we're actually providing people with job subsidies, basically a wage subsidy or a job subsidy. They enable these organizations to do their work in the public interest. That's the goal of what we're doing.
Following up on the issue of that question, since you're talking to some extent about the city of Winnipeg and private landlords, I'll start with the private landlords first. I realize you may not have a definitive answer, but among your candidates, how many of them are landlords, have rental properties, and of those, how many provide rentals to low-income individuals?
You know what? I'll have to check. I would have to check with our. I don't know. Any hands up? Anyone? All right, just Peter. So there we go.
Could you get back to us with that information?
Yeah.
Because there are certainly people out there that would want to make sure that all politicians who endorse these kinds of programs, it's easy to talk the talk, less easy to walk the walk, which raises my next part of it.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Just one of the answers about that. Right now, in terms of conflict of interest, it is the Wild West in Manitoba. Anybody can own anything, but there has been a new law passed which comes into effect, I believe, October 4th. Which is much stricter in terms of disclosures and conflict of interest. It's still not as strict as I would like it to be, but that'll be something that is a new thing that every single MLA going in is going to have to deal with. So there are going to be it is an improved conflict of interest regime. Yes. So what happened with Heather Stephenson, for example, voting to strip tenants of their charter rights at committee when she was a landlord would not be allowed certainly in my caucus.
Now, if I can provide a follow-up question in a slightly different direction, you mentioned Mayor Gillingham.
Yep.
One of the reasons why there's a crisis in the city of Winnipeg in regards to housing stock is that a couple of decades ago, the city started a war on private landlords and on single-occupant rooming houses. And so I'm wondering if you have any views about how to influence the city or suggest the city that they revisit those issues and restore the kind of housing that used to take care of the kinds of individuals that we are now seeing populate our parks, especially here in St. Boniface, where both of us have offices.
Yeah.
Does the city not have a role to play in terms of their zoning and their other regulations? Because a lot of people are comfortable in that environment because it's supportive. There's other people
Yep.
from the same kinds of circumstances as them. So it's not all, rooming houses are not all negative. They didn't used to be all negative, but the city just went on a campaign to drive landlords out of business. Maybe that's what's missing from this equation to some extent.
I have a different interpretation for why homelessness is so bad, which has got to do with the price of housing and debt and all sorts of other things, rather than that.
Lack of supply?
We have an enormous number of empty houses and empty buildings right now, and we have people living on the street. So yeah, it is. It's not just a. Yeah, look, I'll end up completely derailing the thing because I'll end up lecturing.
SROs run by private landlords, single room occupancy. Would you see that rooming houses, etc.? You mentioned the Bell Hotel. That's a version of it.
Yeah.
The Royal Albert turned into something like that.
Yeah.
Would you favor providing tools so that private landlords would be able to provide that kind of housing?
Oh no, look, it's actually, to be very clear, as John Gerard mentioned, if you look at the Medicine Hat example, it's not about public, it's about having trusted relationships with trusted landlords. So if there are trusted and you build trust to say, the organization that is trying to place an individual who's been homeless, they're trusted. They have a good relationship with a private landlord. This is not. It's about safety and about making sure that it happens. But we're not shutting out private landlords in any way. We're just saying that. But absolutely, there have to be standards of safety and security, which in many cases just don't exist. I've met people who are homeless, and that's the issue, that they're
safer not being where they were.
I talked. Look, in October 2019, outside my office window, the Osborne Bridge, there were people living under the Osborne Bridge, and there was a fire there. And I went and talked to them, and one of them was a woman in her 60s because she felt it was too unsafe to live in a rooming house, a multi-room rooming house, right? Mm-hmm. So, no, we still have a problem with safety and security. That has to be insured, but private landlords are part of the equation as well. We're not ruling it out.
Any more questions?
Okay, thank you, merci. Good again.